Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this series may contain images, voices, or names of deceased persons.
This episode, A Wide Brown Land, is part of the series that looks at the land. It begins in Canberra, moves to the port city of Fremantle, and ends on the shores of Bibra Lake in Western Australia. We consider the impact of water scarcity and examine ways of living in a dry and a drying continent.
I'm in the Landmarks Gallery of the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. And the object we're focusing on today is massive, majestic, and in perfect working order. It's a windmill, taken from the Kenya Pastoral Station in far north Queensland and reconstructed here. Windmills are a feature of the Australian landscape. All across the country, great blades like these, powered by the wind, draw water up from the earth, and often they are the only source of water in a parched and arid landscape.
Australia is one of the driest continents on Earth. Much of our inland is one great desert. Over 80% of Australia receives less than 600 millimetres of rainfall in an entire year. And in a land as flat and as hot as this, much of that water simply evaporates. Huge and diverse Australia might be, but only around 7% of this land can actually be farmed. And that helps to explain the presence of windmills, like the one raised on Kenya Station. Low rainfall and variable rainfall meant there were far too few creeks and dams to support those thirsty herds of cattle. Pastoralists on Kensington Downs had access to water, but it was locked away deep underground. The purpose of that windmill was to tap the liquid resources of one of the largest aquifers in the world, the Great Artesian Basin.
So the Kenyan windmill symbolises a hot, dry land, and it also signifies how white Australians chose to live in our semi-arid landscape. Indigenous people moved across this country. In dry times, through long and irregular periods of drought, they followed the course of shifting and contracting waterways. But white settlement was just that, settled. Permanent pastoral stations like those on Kensington Downs required permanent supplies of water, and that usually involved engineering as much as environmental solutions. When this windmill was built in 1925, white settlers believed they'd unlocked an inexhaustible resource. The Great Artesian Basin stretches from the Gulf of Carpentaria to the heart of South Australia. At an average depth of over 500 metres, that vast reserve of water seemed limitless. It's not. The waters in the basin have accumulated over 200 million years. In less than 200 years, European farming practices have squandered millions of litres through evaporation, altered the water table, and brought salt to the surface. In 1925, the Kenyan windmill seemed the settlers' salvation. It promised us limitless supplies of water, the means to make green gardens in an arid wilderness. Now it reminds us of how we have poisoned our landscape.
We've called this episode A Wide Brown Land, and that alerts us to an environmental calamity facing not just Australia, but the whole wide world. By the middle of this century, at least 7 billion people in 60 different countries will be faced with water scarcity. Climate change accounts for declining annual rainfall and worsening water quality. Studies of the Southern Oscillation Index, that powerhouse of shifting ocean temperatures that shape our climate, confirm that hotter and drier weather patterns are more and more likely into the future. And yet despite that, Australians use more water per head of population than most nations in the industrialised world.
This episode takes us to Western Australia, one of the driest states in one of the world's driest continents. And there we'll explore the fraught and changing politics of water.
I'm walking along one of the wharves that line Fremantle Harbour, and this wide, deep waterway is the Swan River. It's surging down from the inland plains all the way to the Indian Ocean. The mighty Swan has a total catchment area of over 100,000 square kilometres. But much of that water simply empties into the sea. And to those who hope to farm the vast, dry expanses of the West, that seemed a waste of simply colossal proportions. Diverting water, harnessing the flow of rivers and turning those rivers inland has been the dream of successive generations of white Australians. It's inspired major engineering projects. The Snowy Mountains scheme in central New South Wales, generating hydroelectricity. The irrigation of the Murray-Darling Basin, to this day Australia's major food bowl. And those engineering solutions seize the imagination of Western Australians as well. This is a statue of C.Y. O'Connor, the Chief Engineer of Western Australia. It's an imposing monument to a most imposing man, and it's placed here on the edge of one of O'Connor's greatest building projects, the harbour here at Fremantle. Now, to build this harbour, 7 million cubic metres of rock and sand was dredged up from the mouth of the Swan River, changing the very shape of that waterway. And then, towards the end of his career, O'Connor took on an even bigger challenge, solving the water shortage of the West. In the late 19th century, the shortage of water here was acute. The discovery of gold had brought untold wealth to the state, but also trebled the population. Miners flocked to the goldfields, settling in the desert towns of Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie. But they needed water, and a great deal of it. To meet that need, O'Connor embarked on an enterprise that was little short of visionary. First, he'd construct a dam, capturing the flow of the Helena River. The river was dammed at a narrow gorge with a 30-metre wall of solid concrete. It was the world's highest overflow weir at the time, and it flooded over 10 kilometres of the rugged valley behind it. And from there, O'Connor built a pipeline, over 500 kilometres of pipeline, transporting water uphill to Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie. 8 steam-powered pumping stations pushed the water inland, lifting it 1,000 feet right over the escarpment. Contemporaries believed the Goldfields pipeline, the longest water main in the world, would forge a river in the desert. Was O'Connor's scheme successful? Well, yes and no. The pipeline delivered water to the goldfields, but the cost was astronomical. The Western Australian government borrowed some £2.5 million to complete that venture. And whatever the scheme may or may not have achieved, C.Y. O'Connor did not live to see its completion. With the project mired in controversy and the public and the press alarmed by a leaking pipeline, C.Y. O'Connor rode his horse into the sea not far from here and shot himself. His sorry end is captured in a sculpture set deep in the waters where he died. It's a bronze statue of a rider, looking back to the harbour O'Connor built and the river that he dreamed of turning inland. C.Y. O'Connor's suicide wasn't the end of white Australia's dream of watering the inland. In this dry and fragile landscape, big and confident engineering solutions retain a powerful attraction. Those 19th century proposals to carry water across our continent are rivalled today by comparably expensive desalination plants, manufacturing water from the ocean. Both schemes promise us abundance in a land where scarcity is actually the norm. Both represent a failure to live within the limits of our landscape. And that failure to adjust to life in a dry and a drying continent is apparent in suburban Perth as well. So let's go to Susan in what's left of this city's wetlands.
I'm walking along the shores of Bibra Lake, not far from Fremantle. The lake is part of a complex network of pools and waterways stretching some 25 kilometres along the coast. These wetlands were formed thousands of years ago in the hollows between ancient sand dunes. And the water you see now is the exposed surface of our groundwater. And at first glance, this nature reserve seems something of a paradise. There are strands of Melaleuca and Banksia, and just look at this magnificent eucalypt. The water attracts bird life from miles around. Riparian vegetation, the grasses, shrubs and bushes that line these banks, provide shelter for insects, lizards and even small marsupials. But appearances are deceptive. Like all the wetlands surrounding Perth and the southwest generally, this is an environment under threat. Since the European occupation of Western Australia, it's estimated that over half the wetlands have been lost, contaminated by agriculture, filled in by housing developments, and, as was the case with the Bibra Lake until quite recently, polluted by landfill. And in a way, the lake has become a sensitive environmental barometer, a canary for climate change. Its water levels sink as rainfall declines, part of the drying of the continent we talked about earlier. Less groundwater makes its way into the lake, and increasing temperatures lead to higher rates of evaporation. And there's no doubt this particular wetland is much smaller than it once was. Today, this lake's an island in a sea of suburban development, and that suburban development directly affects water quality. Until very recently, there was no check on the number of bores diverting water from this lake's aquifer for domestic purposes. Water pumped to the surface and allowed to seep back down into the water table releases salt trapped in the soil for centuries. Salinity is now a major threat to Western Australia's wetlands, and all across the state, indeed right across Australia, the clearing of native vegetation changes the hydrology of this landscape and draws salt to the surface. Out in the wheat belt, rivers carry 50 times more salt than they did in the past. There's so much salt in the soil, it effectively poisons the land and corrodes the foundations of buildings. The life these waters can support is also changing. Outbreaks of blue-green algae and infestations of introduced weeds are also aligned with rising temperatures. And the phosphatic fertilisers washing into these waterways fuel their growth. Once the lake hosted myriad marine species. These have been pushed aside by colonies of mosquito fish, introduced from North America, which prey on native species. Even the bird life, seemingly in abundance here, has steadily declined. And the mass spectacle of these birds conceals a terrible reality. There are fewer wetlands, hence larger concentration of certain species. It's hard to measure what the loss of wetlands might mean. A recent proposal to drive a tollway through the heart of this fragile landscape would be little short of disastrous. Losing habitat for native species is a serious enough blow to Australia's biodiversity. But what happens when this wetland is no longer there for migratory birds? Birds that have flown as far afield as Siberia to feed and to nest here. Think globally, act locally. That adage of the environmental movement rings true here in this tiny stretch of remnant wetland on the outskirts of West Australia's capital. The measures taken by the surrounding households to conserve and recycle water, reduce consumption and defend water quality will affect the future of these wetlands. And it's our future as well. In Aboriginal mythology, the water serpent Wakal is the guardian of these freshwater lakes and springs and rivers. She maintains the flow that brings life anew to these waters. Noongar people have walked these wetlands since time immemorial. They understood the hydrology of the region, the delicate balance that maintained a healthy wetland system. Widgelah, whitefellas, lacked the stories to protect and preserve this landscape. Let's hope it's not too late to learn them.
If you'd like to learn more about the issues raised in this episode, why not catch Susan Carland in conversation? This time, Susan's talking to the environmental historian Ruth Morgan on the heights that line the Swan River.